Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. Paul Smith is a retired Army intelligence officer and Operation Desert Storm veteran. Spent 7 years in the Department of Defense's remote viewing program, serving as operational remote viewer, theory instructor and trainer, security officer, and unit historian. Smith has a BA in Middle Eastern Studies from Brigham Young University and an MS in Strategic Intelligence with a Middle Eastern emphasis from the Defense Intelligence College, and is a doctoral candidate in philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He is president of Remote Viewing Instructional Services at www.rviewer.com and is president of the nonprofit International Remote Viewing Association. Please welcome in today Paul Smith as he introduces us to the history of remote viewing, the power of remote viewing, the truth about remote viewing, and the opportunity of remote viewing. Welcome, Paul Smith, to It's Rainmaking Time.
Thanks. This is exciting.
I've been very interested in remote viewing for a long time. And at first, when I thought about it, the ability to see into distant places, objects, people, events, and places, the details of which really shouldn't be supposedly available to us. It was exciting and it was scary at the same time. And I thought to myself, well, then, if that's possible, is anything really a secret? And not only is anything really a secret, the question, but does time really exist then? Because in order to go back at that level of the past and to be able to hone in using the protocol and methods of remote viewing, something has to be almost recorded in some dimension or on some level. Can you explain that and also introduce your definition of what remote viewing is?
Well, the short answer to whether I can explain or not is no. However, I can speculate. Well, let's see. No, we actually have two different questions on the table. Maybe I should start with remote viewing.
Please.
Remote viewing, interesting. It's been an underlying human phenomenon, human faculty that everybody has, and in fact has been practiced in different forms for probably millennia. But most recently, it was formalized, studied, improved, developed, whatever you want to say, by the U.S. government or on behalf of the U.S. government. It's an ability that all of us have to perceive and become aware of distant places, people, things, or events without having any other connection than our own mental abilities.
Wouldn't the average person associate what you just described as being clairvoyance or being psychic?
Yes, and they might even associate with psychic, but I'll talk about the difference there in a minute. It is actually a form of clairvoyance. In fact, I'll often tell people that I teach a form of disciplined or controlled clairvoyance. But the kind of the difference here, really, it should have been called remote perception. And there actually is a laboratory that did call it that. The PAIR lab, you may be familiar with that, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab at Princeton University, followed the remote viewing protocol, essentially, added a precognitive element to it, but they called it remote perception. And the reason is this, because it involves not just what you can see, not what you might visualize, but it also involves all the other senses as well. You smell, taste, touch, hear when you're doing a remote viewing session. At least those are available to you. So remote viewing in a way is a little bit more than clairvoyance. Clairvoyance, French word for clear seeing or clear vision. And so again, that focuses more on the visual aspects of it. But remote viewing is a much larger basket of experiences. Now, I should up front put in the caution here that it isn't the same kind of experience one has if one is walking down the street and smelling things and feeling things and seeing things. It isn't that pronounced, it isn't that strong as direct seeing and hearing and smelling in a normal waking environment. But what comes in, I often describe as it's like a half-remembered memory that you know is not a memory you had. So you have, in quality, it is kind of ephemeral, but it is, if you learn how to get into the groove where the information is coming in, the information is, the experience is vague but yet present. And when you learn to distinguish that, then you know that you're getting real information, and you are able to then cognize and describe what you're experiencing.
Do you agree that with Ingo Swann, one of the fathers of remote viewing, that this faculty or ability has been a sidelined human function in a world run by scientists and skeptics, and that this is really available to all people who are receptive to this? Is that correct?
I think it's basically correct. And he's right about it being sidelined, although it hasn't always been scientists and skeptics. It's been anyone who is more of a touching. If you can't see it, feel it, smell it, or touch it, it's not real. Those kind of folks aren't always scientists and skeptics, but they tend to reject anything that is subjective or is something they can't really grab a hold of. And that actually came to bite us in the end in the remote viewing military program, because those kind of folks can also be managers in bureaucracies, right? and that ended up being a problem, but we can talk about that later. So
weren't you one of the first people or one of the first teams of formal remote viewers that were trained, or were you?
Well, I was kind of a second generation.
Okay.
When the military program got started, there was a select group of about 6 folks with some part-timers in addition who were chosen to start the program in 1979. I and my colleagues started coming in around 1983, and we, in a way, were I don't want to say product improved, because the folks that went before us were really good. But we had a different approach that was presented to us called controlled remote viewing. It was a more formal, structured method developed by the folks who originally developed remote viewing in general. It was developed. The controlled remote viewing was developed as a way of being able to transfer to non-psychics, people who had not demonstrated psychic ability in the past, transfer to non-psychics some of the functionality that the more accomplished remote viewers had demonstrated. So in other words, it's a transferable skill, and this methodology is developed to make it more transferable, and it worked.
Before we go in more thoroughly into what the applications are, some of the inner workings of how one learns it, I would like you to explain what, in your view, led you into remote viewing, and whether you think it was synchronicity, or it just happened, or divined, or in fact it was just an opportunity that dropped in your lap. And your original first impressions, I think, were interesting in your book titled Reading the Enemy's Mind: Inside Stargate, America's Psychic Espionage Program. I mean, somebody hears that and they're like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Why worry about the National Security Agency going through your data, your internet, and your phone when you got this, right?
That's right. Yeah, I almost want to say magic rather than synchronicity. How I ended up in the program was really a miracle in a way. The irony is, I was just reflecting on this the other day, that you talk about, for example, the popularization of the manifesting phenomenon in The Secret. The Secret talks about this. The idea is that if you wish for things in the right way, ultimately they may come to pass, right? And of course, it's always an uncertain process. But in my case, it really sort of happened. It was a combination of that old song "Taxi." What was it? I can't think of the musician that sang it, but it was the story about this guy and his girlfriend in high school, and they had all these dreams about what they were going to do these great things in the world, and then they end up doing exactly what they dreamed, except not in the great ways they thought.
Sounds like a Seinfeld translation of the dream.
In a way it is, yeah.
Right?
And in fact, that's sort of what happened with me. As a high school, junior high student, I had read lots of science fiction involved ESP, and I was very fascinated by ESP. I had all my whole life been interested in the military, and I was interested in things like special forces and armored warfare and all of that. And then I also was fascinated by the world of intelligence, more particularly the kind of caricature of it that James Bond and those kind of secret agents kind of things portrayed. And so I'm wishing I could be a military super spy using ESP powers when I grew up. And by the time I grew up, I had dismissed all of that. Now it's just youthful dreams, nothing to that. And doggone, within about 10 years, I was a military remote viewer and using ESP and had been in special forces for 3 years, and all of that stuff came to pass. And here's the interesting thing about it, and perhaps a lesson for everybody. I didn't try to make any of that happen. It happened to me.
Wow.
So
does that have something to do with the field of desire and intent? That there's almost a imprint there that is given to us maybe when we're born or whatever, of areas of interest, a desire, that they're organic, and that eventually there's a divine plan, so to speak. I'm not asking you to commit to that.
Of course, I think there probably is a divine plan. What the details are, I don't know.
Well, we never get to know the details, do we? It's always that need-to-know contract.
Well, that's it. Kind of, if we knew the details, we would actually probably thwart the plan, either accidentally or on purpose, right?
Yes, I agree.
So there is a certain value in being ignorant.
I agree.
We have to, of course, be careful how we mean that. But that's an interesting idea that you've suggested there, that maybe we sort of catch wind of what we're supposed to be doing when we're young, and the ideas come in, but we don't really take them seriously, and then our lives unfold. I mean, and that's plausible. And of course, it could tie in with Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphogenesis.
The morphogenic field?
Yeah.
What is that? Explain that to the audience, would you?
Well, the scientist Rupert Sheldrake has come under a lot of criticism from mainstream science because he's proposed the idea that there are patterns, underlying patterns in the universe, and large scale and actually small scale also, that affect us, that are not scientifically detectable. They're not electromagnetic. They just establish these patterns that we can fall into, and they can act as guiding influences. They're both physical, mental, and spiritual, perhaps even, such that things are guided in the future to happen or to adopt certain shapes or forms or whatever, based on things having been that way in the past. But past and future in this case are a little squishy because morphic fields can also reach back in the past and affect things, as I understand the theory. So perhaps our lives somewhat are part of the nested morphic fields of the universe, and it's hard to say.
In remote viewing, explain your take on time, because in order for you to do what you do, which is to go back through distance in time and space and access data that's precise, in some way, that data has to be on record of some kind. And I say on record, meaning as a reference point. It has to be almost like a computer, not a computer, but somehow that data bits are stored somewhere. What we call that is a whole other thing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yes. And I'm glad you brought us back to that. I was trying to figure out how to do that.
I'll keep us in focus. Even though between this whole field, one could be very lost. I'm scared I'm going to become a tachyon at any moment, but please go ahead.
Well, then, of course, you aren't tied to time, too. You can be on time for every engagement, no matter when you leave.
That's fabulous. Go ahead.
I really need it because I'm always late to things.
Don't tell the audience that.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
Talk about the time element and the fact that, because there's no way you could do what you could do if there wasn't a record of data somewhere.
Right. And this is a particularly interesting issue to me now because, as we have previously discussed, I just turned in my dissertation to my committee for their consideration. And there's a whole chapter on that deals with this issue: backward causation, precognition, what all that implies and means. And time, probably the easiest way to space this out is, well, that's an interesting phrase, space out time. But anyway, the past exists in some sense. There's no such thing as the present. And the future doesn't exist yet, but it consists, to whatever degree it consists in, of a large number of possible futures that have not yet been realized. So what I mean by the past exists, that is a little bit unknown. We just know in remote viewing that if we remote view the past, we're just as successful as we remote view the present. And I'll explain, there's an inconsistency here because I just said the present doesn't exist. I'll explain that in a second. But if we remote view something in real time or remote view it in the past, we have essentially the same degree of accuracy in doing that. So that suggests there is something of the past that's still there. Now, one could argue, well, it's just you're remote viewing the memories of people who know something about it, you're remote viewing the artifacts that still exist left over from past events. But frankly, the experience of remote viewing the past is much more vivid than that. And the farthest back that I can recall doing a remote viewing session was to 1066 BC, and I'll explain how that happened. We were on assignment to JTF-4 in Key West and supporting the war on drugs, counter-narcotics trade, going against the narcotics trade. And one of the operations officers, an Army major, was dubious about what we were doing. He didn't really believe it. He was a bit of a skeptic. And so he gets me off by myself at one point, and he says, I'm really having a hard time with this. Can you do a demonstration for me so I can see how it works and so I can kind of test to see if it works? Of course, those are always watershed moments. First of all, remote viewing doesn't work all the time. So when somebody wants a demo, you start sweating right then, because what if this is one of those times it fails and a lot hinges on it succeeding at this point, right?
But neither does anything else work all the time. Isn't that true also?
That's true, although some things are much more reliable than others.
In the psychic realm or in the clairvoyant realm?
Oh, in the psychic realm. No, I thought you were...
Yeah, there's nothing that, I've been given totally false information by psychics and clairvoyants and channelers, totally wrong. Off.
Well, take a little side jog here for a second. There are two problems with that. Some people who are acting as psychics or profess to be psychics aren't. And so you're only going to get real stuff out of them accidentally, right? But then there are those others who are acting as psychics or claim to be psychics who really are.
Right.
And those guys, you're going to get accurate information, but there will be times when you don't get accurate information, and we have no idea why it is that way, because we don't understand the causality involved here. So, yeah, you're exactly right. No ESP or any of these underlying conscious phenomena, none of them work 100% of the time. They're not like picking up the phone and calling somebody.
The transmitter, you don't know what they're tapping into is the real key.
Yep, that's right. So anyway, this guy wanted me to do a demo, and so I'm starting to sweat bullets on this. Oh, no, it's kind of crucial the operation officer believes in what you're doing. And what if I do this demo and I fail? Then he's going to be even more doubtful about it. But, you can't turn it down. You got to do it. You just got to, as we say, soldier on, right? So I said, okay. He said, well, I have a target. It's on a piece of paper that I folded up several times so there's no chance you can see it. I've stuck it in my pocket. I know what the target is. I'm not going to tell you at all what it is. Now, I'd like you to see what you can do on this. Now, this isn't a strictly scientific experiment because it's only single blind. The guy there knew what the target was, but he was actually pretty good at not communicating non-verbally. So at any rate, I don't pay attention to anybody in the room anyway. I focus on what I'm doing. So I'm sitting there at the table, and I start doing my session, and to kind of cut to the chase, I start getting impressions of a landscape, rolling grassy hills, not a lot of bigger vegetation. It's kind of foggy, hazy. It felt like it was early morning. And there's all these people running around with bare legs and kind of rough kind of clothing, and they have edged weapons, and they're fighting amongst themselves. And I'm thinking, oh, man, this can't possibly be the target he would pick. This is just, I've got to be off. This is just crazy. Right about then, he said, okay, that's enough. I'm convinced. I'm going, what? I thought I'd blown it, and he's telling me I didn't. He said, here, and he tossed the paper across the table, and I unfolded about 6 times. and it's Battle of Hastings, 1066.
Wow.
So that was both interesting from the fact that I was able to persuade this guy, but also interesting from the fact is it tells us something about time in that I was able to remote view and have the experience of the Battle of Hastings as if it were still happening in a way. Now, how that is in the past, because we know it's not happening anymore. Everybody there is dead and nothing but bones, if that, by now. The landscape's different, everything. And I have never had any preconception about how the Battle of Hastings would have looked. So this experience I'm having, this inner experience I'm having in the remote viewing session, was just kind of new. It was novel. And I had no expectation of it being real or anything. And so what does that mean? Well, it means, apparently, that I was tapping into something that had literal information and maybe a portrayal of the events, or maybe it was the real event itself. Of course, we can't sort that out. But what puts this all together is the idea of the matrix, as described by the people who developed remote viewing, particularly a gentleman by the name of Ingo Swann, who perhaps many of your listeners are already familiar with his name, hopefully. He invented the term remote viewing. He invented the original protocol. It was then, of course, it developed more significantly at SRI, International Stanford Research Institute. And the theories that they developed there propose that there is a sort of, I don't know, hyperspatial, wherever it is,
Well, let's try to describe it, because you can detect and describe a location as far away as the other side of the globe without the aid of the usual five senses.
Uh-huh.
So
the idea is that all information in the universe about any target you might remote view.
And what do you mean by a target for the average person who doesn't have a context for that word?
A target is whatever you're asked to remote view, essentially. It's going to be something generally concrete. It's going to be a place or a person or an event or a object, something like that. And then you can get both concrete details about it, properties and qualities, colors, tastes, and you can also get abstract things about it. It has to do with tourism. It has to do with the military. See, those are not things that are innate in a physical object. Those are things we have to conclude about it. So you can get abstract and concrete information about these things. And you sometimes can even pick up on people's mental content, but we won't worry about that right now. Telepathy kinds of things. So according to Ingo's theory, the idea is that there's the matrix. It's kind of like the Akashic Records, but the Akashic Records has to do more with things with moral implications, karmic sorts of things. This is neutral according to that. It's just the repository of all information about the universe. And
both animate and inanimate, correct?
Both, yes. Animate, inanimate, and
unlimited by time and space?
I'm sorry?
It's unlimited by time and space?
Well, that's hard to say. We don't know what it is. Time,
the source of the data.
Yeah, it's data, and it's sort of independent. Let's put it that way. It's independent of time and space. So when you access something in the past, then your consciousness goes, and I use go, put little scare quotes around goes. Your consciousness then obtains information from the matrix to provide to you so that you can report on what it is you've perceived. And it holds all this information and certainly everything about the past. So the example I often like to use is the Eiffel Tower. The matrix has every possible detail about the Eiffel Tower, from its original raw materials to its planning, to the smelting process that provided the steel that built it, to the actual building of it, and ultimately to its ultimate demise. There's a little bit of an issue there. I want to get back to time now. I've talked a bit about the matrix. I want to get back to time.
Can I just ask you one quick question before we go right to time, just to clarify to the listener? In an analogy, could we assert that the matrix functions like an infinite hard drive?
That's not a bad analogy.
Just to give a referential place for how to refer to it.
Yeah, let's just think of it in those terms. That's a good way of describing
Okay.
it. I've often talked about it as being a database, but that makes the image a little more.
Yeah, I think for the average person to really get the context of this, because it's so conceptual,
It's a hard drive, and
that never ends.
access that. Yeah, or at least we can pick what we need out of it.
Okay.
Where we are in relation to that is of course, who knows that either. But okay, so the past may be stored in the matrix. When I say the present doesn't exist, it's because all the present really is the interface between the past and the future. It's where what's happened comes together with what hasn't happened yet. And our impression of the future, of present, is just the fact that we have this short consciousness window. So it's about a tenth of a second between what we perceive on the outside becomes registered and comes into our conscious awareness. Our subconscious recognizes things in real time. Our conscious awareness, the part of us that's waking and that we think is in charge of everything.
Can you define the subconscious, not to stop your flow of information, but people often confuse the subconscious with the unconscious and the superconscious. So I noticed in your book, there's a lot of reference to the subconscious being part of the process that allows, the mechanism that allows for accessing remote viewing. Can you explain it?
Well, probably not any better than anybody else can, but,
okay.
But subconscious, when I talk about subconscious, I actually kind of roll the unconscious into that. This idea about unconscious, subconscious, and superconscious, and all the little divisions of that, those all are very theory-laden. If you're Freudian, you understand that one way. If you're Jungian, you understand it a different way. If you're a neuropsychologist, you understand it in a completely other way altogether. And the bottom line is nobody really knows what we're talking about when we're talking about subconscious, unconscious, and superconscious. It's basically different people have different theories about what all that means. When I use the term subconscious, I'm basically talking about everything that isn't conscious. So that might include everything, right?
Okay.
It's just the part of our mental functioning that we do not have awareness of, do not have direct awareness of. And frankly, that's about 9/10 of the iceberg. We have this illusion that our entire mental life is our conscious awareness, the part that we wake up to in the morning and that interacts with our computers and the people around us and makes us aware of ourselves. But frankly, most of the work is being done by our subconscious, not just our physical processing and keeping all the automatic systems running, perceiving, addressing things that we aren't consciously aware of. In fact, all of our sensory processes come into our subconscious first. And then our subconscious selectively feeds it to our conscious awareness, which is kind of going along for the ride in many cases.
So the subconscious kind of runs things, whether we agree or know it or not. Could you say that?
To a great extent, it does. And I mean, there's a lot of debate about whether maybe we're just automata that our subconscious just kind of run things according to a preset pattern and adapts and adjusts to the environment. I frankly think there's a lot more to it than that. That's, of course, a kind of a materialist, physicalist explanation. Folks that don't want to believe there really is a God in the machine, so to speak.
Interesting.
Right? But it's still completely true that our subconscious does pretty much all of the work that's automated, such as heart rate. Of course, that's run by the autonomic nervous system, but the subconscious plays a role.
I didn't know that. I didn't know the subconscious does that.
Well, that's actually another interesting topic. Remind me, and we'll get back to that. But there's a lot of stuff. So in fact, the subconscious even governs our reactions. If you're driving down the road and a kid darts out in front of your car, in less time than your conscious awareness has to recognize what's happened, your subconscious has already put your foot on the brake. And of course, that's not an automatic action. That's one that takes recognition of an issue, recognition of a problem, problem solving, and then implementing the solution to the problem. There's a whole process going on. It happens much quicker than our conscious awareness becomes aware of.
Fascinating. I want to take you back to time. You were going to say something specifically about time. You did. You talked about the past, and you talked about that we really can't be 100% in the present, because by the time we're aware that we're in the present, we're just clicking into something that just happened a few seconds ago.
And what that boils down to is that there's no such thing as the present. It's really just the very recent past. Because what we perceive consciously as happening now actually happened about a tenth of a second before.
Fascinating.
So,
wow.
So the present kind of filters out of the whole thing. When you're remote viewing supposedly present and past, you're really always remote viewing the past. It's just a matter of degree. The future is a whole different breed of cat here. In fact, a cat of nine tails showing on there.
I was going to say, it's because a lot of the remote viewing commercialism that's on the internet is very much geared toward being able to see the future with precision using remote viewing. That's one of the things that both attracted me, but also as I did my research, I realized there's a lot of discrepancy between methods and protocols that different practitioners are using and teaching and packaging and claiming that are all very different. So you learned from the original Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ and Ingo?
Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swan, yeah.
Right. Talk about that method and protocol for just a moment.
Well, see, now I'm tempted to go in two different directions here. All right, yeah, that's probably a good thing to do. Okay, so basically what happened is once I got recruited by the Army, we didn't get to that story, but I had no idea that remote viewing existed. And they came to me and said, we think you might be good. Do you want to do it? And of course, at that point, there was no question. It was one of the most fascinating things I'd ever heard in the military. And I said, sure, I'd love to try it. So what they did is they shipped me and some other folks off to California to the Stanford Research Institute, actually known by then as SRI International, huge government think tank. This remote viewing thing was just a tiny wart on the back of the neck of SRI, frankly.
Why do you refer to it as a wart? Because it was like a tiny, appendage?
Well, it was because that, by and large, most people kind of look down their nose at it. I mean, it had the support of the SRI leadership, I guess you'd call it. It had the support of them, and it had the support of some other folks. But by and large, if anybody there knew about it, it was mostly hard scientists at SRI. Oh, they had social sciences as well. But all those kind of folks are really in the present, touchy-feely. We don't believe in this kind of stuff.
Well, it's kind of scary, don't you think?
Well, it is for them, which is exactly what my whole dissertation is about.
Yeah, because isn't the military kind of paradigm about control and command and that which you have dominion over, and then there's this huge project that has to do with that which we don't have any dominion over.
Yeah. Well, although SRI is pretty much all civilian, but nonetheless they do have kind of that same context, that same format of belief, right? So they were a bit uncomfortable. It was a strange mix to be researching so-called paranormal phenomenon in a think tank that specialized in studying the effects of nuclear weapons and long-range communications and all kinds of stuff like that, right? So anyway, I get shipped off there to these guys, and it's a very small operation in a very large think tank. And
were you nervous at any point?
My big the thing I was nervous about was whether or not I'd actually be able to do it.
Got it. That's what you said in your book, actually.
Yeah, I wasn't worried about going there. That was an adventure. And I was very excited about that. I wasn't particularly worried about the phenomenon itself. I didn't feel that it was evil or a threat or anything like that. In fact, it kind of fit in. It just felt right. But my worry was I didn't know if I could actually do it. So we go and we get trained in this process, which, of course, as I said, is called controlled remote viewing. And it really kind of starts at the actual foundation of human perception. It's a bare bones thing, makes no metaphysical assumptions. We don't think in terms of channeling. We don't think in terms of spirit cells. We don't think in terms of any of the kind of standard explanations people have for so-called psychic phenomena. It just is a bare bones matter of fact. Do this, do this, do this. we have this idea that there's got to be something like a matrix to get the information from just because of how the phenomenon works. What they were doing was allowing the phenomenon to tell them about itself rather than they trying to impose their preconceived notions on how the phenomenon ought to behave.
That's fascinating. That's almost like letting the art speak to you. Letting the
And
art tell you what it is instead of you trying to impose your view on what the art is.
yes, and of course I studied art, so I think that's where that metaphor came from.
Wow. Okay, good.
Because it really is kind of like that. And the value of this, and one of the values in the fact that it was physicists that got into this and not parapsychologists. One of the issues I'm observing in the parapsychology discipline, which I have great respect for, is that oftentimes it's turned around, where people come into the discipline, they have a kind of a preconceived notion about what being psychic or whatever we want to call it is all about, and so then they study it from the perspective of their own preconceptions. And quite frequently, experiments fail, replications don't work, they don't show a very strong effect, and they think it's because there's something wrong with the phenomenon, when in reality it's the narrow constraints that they are imposing on it that keep it from being able to be realized in its full potential.
Don't you think that most people, even very capable people, have a certain dynamic where they're used to imposing their will, their opinions, their thought projections onto things anyway? And therefore, until they can get totally quiet and access the capacity for reception, it's a challenge.
Well, I think if everybody could do what you said last,
Right.
you would have a much less interesting world because there'd be much less conflict.
Okay. Well, I hear that Richard Bach, who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, put up $40,000 for this project.
He did.
Isn't
and
that
he
cool?
Actually wrote an introduction to the book. So what happened was the CIA came, back up a little bit more, Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann got together in a very interesting way. Neither one of them intended to get together, but it ended up that way through a chain of events. And they did an experiment, and actually in the physics building at Stanford University, which was successful. And Puthoff circulated a little paper around describing the experiment, and the CIA got a hold of it. And the CIA was actually looking for someone like Puthoff. They didn't know who it would be, but they were looking for someone like Puthoff because the Soviets were hugely involved in the field, and the CIA needed a credible scientist to help them find out if there's anything to parapsychology, if it was a potential threat. So they got a hold of Puthoff's paper, and they said, well, we got to look into this. So they came out and they talked to Puthoff. They ran a couple of tests and stuff with Ingo, and it was successful. So they said, we're going to give you some money and do a contract. But before they got around to doing that, the program got going, but there wasn't any funding for it because the CIA hadn't come through with what they needed yet. And so Puthoff, and by this time Russell Targ had come on board, they beat the bushes until they found somebody who could help them finance the early stages of the program, and that one of those was Richard Bach.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that totally amazing?
Yeah.
Wow, is he alive still?
He is. I actually had some interaction with him a year ago. We were hoping to get him as a speaker at our annual remote viewing conference, and he declined. He's in his mid-70s. He's got a certain amount of stuff that he needs to get done before he dies, I guess, is kind of how he put it. He didn't put it literally that way, but that's what he
Sure. No, the whole sense of time changes as you get older.
Yeah, you find out, 15 books to write, and I have time to write 2. Bach put up the $40K, but his condition was, and I don't know if I got this in my book, because Hal has kind of told me about this more recently. His condition was that he had to do a remote viewing session first to see if it really worked. And so Bach actually became an experimental subject. And did at least one remote viewing trial, double blind, the whole procedure, and it was successful, and he was impressed enough, he said, okay, and he wrote him a check. And he also wrote the introduction to their book, Mind Reach, or an introduction.
Is that still available too?
Yes. I can't remember. Hampton Roads Press republished it in 2001, maybe 2002, something like that. It may be back out of print, but there's enough copies out there that you can get a get one.
You know, Jonathan, just a word I want to acknowledge Richard Bach. That book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, is so profound. It's all over the world and it applies to kids and to adults, and it is so empowering. It was one of the big inspirations of my life. So I think it's very fortuitous and synchronistic that he was involved in remote viewing, which is really extraordinary. You were talking about Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann and the work at SRI.
Right. So, you know, the program went on for a long time, for years. I got involved in it in 1983 because they had started to develop this controlled remote viewing process, which I'd mentioned earlier. They started developing that in the very early 80s, under contract, really, to the Army Intelligence and Security Command.
What does the Army Intelligence and Security Command do? Can you just give the listener a context?
It's kind of the one-stop shop for intelligence in the Army. Every relatively large Army unit, combat unit, has an intelligence staff officer and staff team. And those guys help the commander. But the Army itself has a much larger intelligence responsibility. And so a large major command, we're talking thousands and thousands of people, was created, let's say in the mid-70s, called the Army Intelligence and Security Command, to bring together all of the functions of intelligence that the Army is supposed to do. And the intelligence training is part of it, because they have to train all these folks that are out in all the combat units, and plus the people who participate in the joint kind of intelligence collection organizations like Defense Intelligence Agency and National Security Agency. So it both trains and uses Army intelligence personnel.
How is it different than the CIA? Just for the listener.
Well, there's several different ways. First off, the CIA is a strictly civilian organization directly under the president. And they collect strategic, they collect diplomatic, they collect sociological, they collect all of these broader categories of information and intelligence that's important for our senior decision makers to make the right choices. Hopefully they do. Sometimes they don't. INSCOM and Army intelligence, it has a more specific mission of collecting intelligence that is militarily relevant.
Got it. Okay.
To support the warfighter and that sort of thing. Now, of course, they get up to higher levels. They do collect some diplomatic and such if it pertains to military type things, right? So, anyway, so that's the overall function of INSCOM. And, of course, it became the home to remote viewing, but that happened a little bit later. Anyway, the program at SRI proceeded along, and they had a number of different sponsors. The CIA bailed out in 1975 for a lot of different reasons, partly because they were actually under scrutiny by Congress because of a bunch of things they shouldn't have had ought done, and they did. And so the CIA was in trouble, and the current director said, well, let's get rid of anything that is controversial or dangerous or illegal. And, of course, remote viewing fit in the controversial part, so they just kind of abandoned the program. Air Force picked it up for a little while, and then ultimately Army became a sponsor. And finally, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the military's answer to the CIA.
Do you accept the information that other countries' intelligence agencies were at work on something similar to remote viewing prior to the U.S. getting into it?
We know the Soviets were, and some of the Eastern Bloc countries were part of the effort.
Interesting.
But whether anybody else was or not, I think the evidence is pretty slim. Now, later on, I think that some of the Western countries, perhaps China, sort of said, hey, this looks interesting, let's see if we can do anything. But I don't think any of their efforts measured up size or success to ours or the Soviets. The Soviets was huge. They were spending hundreds of millions of dollars in this realm and associated realms, which makes it kind of silly when people complain about the American program. They say, well, gee, the U.S. spent $20 million on this psychic stuff. How silly is that? That's $20 million over 23 years. It's less than $1 million a year. I mean, that isn't even above the noise level in the national budget, not even in the defense budget. The Soviets are spending hundreds of millions of dollars. And It's it's an interesting comparison of scale there to see.
It's even thought in some circles, Paul, that the Soviets have extremely advanced scientific information and studies about the area of frequency, electromagnetics, in health and in other areas.
They obviously were focusing on that area. How good their research was is open to debate.
Okay.
As we've noticed a number of times during the Cold War, we thought the Soviets were far more advanced than it turned out they really were in many fields. There were a number of gaps. One of them was the missile gap, where we thought the Soviets had us outclassed. We found out later, actually, that they didn't. But we started really going crazy because we didn't want to be vulnerable to them, and so we really outbuilt them. We ended up with far superior technology and weapons than the Soviets did, and it was almost an accident. It was a misperception that it happened that way.
Is that something that was verified through remote viewing?
Oh, no, that's stuff that we've been able to learn from conventional intelligence.
Got it.
Remote viewing is more of a surgical tool. It probably isn't going to answer that broad of a question.
Got it.
But we did do stuff against Soviet missile developments, for example, and so probably remote viewing contributed to some of that.
What did you do at the Monroe Institute? And could you explain what the Monroe Institute influence was in your training and thinking and what they were doing with frequencies and left and right hemispheres and this thing called hemisync?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting and of course very involved topic on its own. But sort of the short version, the Monroe Institute was founded by a guy named Robert Monroe, who's famous in out-of-body circles because he wrote the book Journeys Out of the Body. The whole idea of out-of-body experience, that term actually was coined to describe what was happening with Bob Monroe. And it was coined by a famous parapsychologist, psychologist, Charles Tart. Tart was actually working with Monroe to trying to figure out what the heck was going on with him. So Monroe had these experiences, and he thought, well, gee, how can we get other people to have those kind of experiences too? Because there are people who want them, but I don't know how to tell them how to do it. I can tell them, but I can't get them to. And he was actually kind of a pioneer in commercial radio. So he thought, oh, I'm a sound engineer. Maybe there's something we can do with sound. And so he developed this technology that involved the frequency following response of the brain. Basically, what you do is you play one tone, a sound tone in one ear, and you play another tone in the other ear that's just slightly out of phase. It's just a slightly different note than the one's going in the ear. And you've probably heard where two tones come together, but they're not quite in sync, and you get this wavering sound. Woo, 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 kind of like that. Well, whatever. Anyway, the interesting thing is if you play that through the ears, of course, the ear converts the sound to an electrical signal. And so you have two slightly out of phase electrical signals, one coming from each ear, and they meet in the middle in the brain, and it creates a third frequency. That's that woo, woo, woo sound. And by varying the tone, you can make that a faster or a slower frequency. And Bob discovered that if you did this right, you could get both hemispheres synchronized on that frequency.
And what would the benefit of that be?
Well, they're still finding that out. One of the benefits seems to be that it enhances the learning experience. Another one is that you can kind of impose moods or states of consciousness. You can help induce a certain state of consciousness in a person. And so Bob was, of course, trying to find the right brain state that would allow people to go out of body.
By the way, what you said before that is absolutely fascinating about being able to induce mood states via frequency. I'm sure that has a substantive focus in somewhere on the earth in terms of how far that can be expanded, both positive probably and negatively as well.
There are some psychologists that are actually working with this. So it came to be called hemisync for hemispheric synchronization. So hemisync, some psychologists working with this, trying to see how it applies in a classroom learning environment or how it might work in therapy with patients, things like that. And there have been some interesting results. I haven't really followed it closely, so I can't really tell you much about that. But I know there's research ongoing. There have been some provocative kinds of results. So that'd be interesting. And as I understand that they're still continuing.
By the way, when is your next training session for 2009?
I have a course starting on 10 December.
And how many days is it?
It lasts 5 days. It's about 40 hours, 5 days, very intensive.
It sounds like a big commitment. How many people are optimal for a class?
I prefer not to teach any more than 2 people at a time per instructor. So, for example, if I have 2 people sign up for a class, then I will be their instructor, and that's all I will let in. If more people want to sign up, then I will see if I have one of my assistant instructors available, and if I do, then I'll let those people take the class as well. So,
boy, that's very different than what I'm seeing in the commercial remote viewing quote online market and market in general.
Yes, there's an attempt to scale this up where one instructor might teach 20 or 30 or 50 or even in some cases 500 people. And while you can teach the rudiments of remote viewing to a group that large, it's very hard to actually transfer the skill.
Got it.
Because a lot of teaching remote viewing is actually helping the student as they go through a remote viewing session and going through the process. And you can't do that in a room full of 500 people. That's very much a one-on-one kind of an intimate sort of a situation where it takes one instructor and one student to work through a session like that and to be able to work through the process.
By the way, I like what you said about transferring the skill, because at the end of the day, it would not be sufficient to just have information and walk away after 5 days with a lot of exciting information and have no skill being developed.
I absolutely agree, which is why I do it this way. And it's unfortunately it isn't. I mean, my courses are relatively expensive compared to the ones that are doing 500 people because I don't have the same economy of scale. It's very much a hands-on kind of a Rolls-Royce sort of a process, right? Rolls-Royce is being hand-built, right? All that. So I'm not able to teach a lot of students. So I'm obviously not in it for a huge profit here.
I have a question about if you could speak for a few minutes about the applications. People are going to go learn remote viewing. For what purposes? What applications? What are their motivations for learning it? And what can they expect in terms of being able to have the skill transferred to them to apply this to what? What will they be empowered to potentiate?
You're basically asking the question, why learn remote viewing?
Exactly.
Yeah. And the answer to that is as almost as varied as there are people. I'll give you the main reason people come to take my classes, and then we'll explore other possibilities. The main reason people come is it's a kind of a self-actualization tool. Here they are taking on something that society claims is impossible to do. And so if society says it's impossible to do and yet you do it, that you're successful at it, what does that say about you? And how does that affect your perception of not just yourself, but all humans in general? And so people find it in that respect a very rewarding and enlightening kind of a transformative experience. I mean, I can't use the word differently. One of the gratifications in this to me is to see a student nail a target, or at least describe it in really pretty good detail, a target they could not possibly have known anything about under normal means, and see what kind of an effect that has on them. It's very very transformative. They get very excited about it, and they kind of get amazed themselves.
Is it almost like finding out that you have an invisible third eye and it has this ability to tap into this infinite hard drive called the matrix and locate with specificity animate and inanimate things?
I think it's actually more profound than even that.
Okay.
I think at least some people, I'm not going to say everybody has the experience quite so profoundly, but I think a good share of the people who take the class and are successful have a realization about their own personal natures that they might have kind of cognitively accepted before, but now they know. It's not just a intellectual kind of a conviction. It becomes a very fundamental conviction that they really are more than their physical bodies, that they really are much a larger kind of an entity than our current physical paradigm of the world wants to claim. They aren't just meat machines, as is often said, but there is something innate in humans and in them individually that transcends nature, transcends the physical part of the universe.
I would imagine the whole worldview changes once you have access to that experientially.
I think you and I have discussed a little bit about near-death experiences. It's not probably the same character as that, but the implications are kind of the same. That the same kind of transformative experience that affects some people with near-death experiences, at least is of the same character as the kind of experience that people can have when they're successful in remote viewing.
Well, what makes for a good remote viewer?
Well, that is a very good question.
In your experience so far?
I would say that first, one of the most valuable things is an open mind. The folks who come to my courses who think they already know what being psychic is all about tend to have quite a struggle because they're not able to let go of their preconceptions about it. And whatever it amounts to, there are a myriad of different ways people can approach ESP, can approach psychic experience. It's bound to be that some are better than others, and some are more successful than others, because there's a lot of, I guess I could call it cultural baggage attached to any number of these metaphysical systems. There's some presumptions and stuff that probably don't have anything to do with the process itself, but they can get in the way of being successful. The beauty of remote viewing is, as it was developed in the lab, is that it makes no metaphysical presuppositions about how the universe is, how you do the process. It just found out the rules that made it work and teaches the rules. Kind of gives you the formula, kind of gives you the recipe. And you don't have to, you can believe any darn thing you want as long as when you sit down in your remote viewing session, you do what you're supposed to do to be successful, and you'll succeed. In some ways, it's interesting. It's kind of made me doubtful about any metaphysical claims. I'll get people come in and they'll talk about this or that or the other. I'm trying to think of some good examples. I'm blanking on any of them right now. But they'll come in and they'll have an assumption about what being psychic is about, and they'll have some metaphysical context. And I don't know what to say to it, because frankly, it's got nothing to do with how it actually works. So
the best candidates that would come to your class need to come putting their assumptions to the side and becoming as empty as they can to receive the new input.
Exactly. That's a very, very good way of putting it. So that's important.
What is this thing called the signal line, by the way, unless I'm taking you too far ahead in the conversation?
Well, I'm going to give you a couple more criteria.
Okay,
hopefully
sure.
I won't get carried away philosophizing like I did on the previous one. But another one is, although I think everybody has the underlying capability, some people get it a little bit better than others. And part of it is, I think, and this is shown in the laboratory, the more intelligent you are, as long as you can let go of preconceptions, the more intelligent you are, the easier it is for you. It doesn't mean if you don't have the hugest IQ in the world that you're not going to be successful. It's just that it becomes easier the smarter you are, I guess. Oftentimes, actually, a little hint of skepticism helps. You come in thinking that it might be possible, but not absolutely sure. In other words, you're not a true believer. You're not already sold on it. Interestingly enough, that tends to help people succeed, I think, as well. It's also useful to have some kind of creative pursuit, because remote viewing seems to be a very right brain thing.
Yeah, like, for example, I'm very right brain, even though I can also be very analytical, but I don't know how to draw at all. I mean, I draw stick people. Do I have to take a drawing class if I want to learn this?
Well, I actually recommend folks develop their drawing skills, but you don't have to do that to learn it.
Okay.
And you don't even have to have good drawing skills to be successful at it. It's just that sketching and drawing is one of the ways you download information. And so if you have some capability at representing things the way you're perceiving them, that's always helpful.
Isn't that book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, doesn't that help activate the area or faculty that allows you to draw and sketch?
That is a wonderful book. And in fact, I used it as an instruction tool, they asked me because of my background in art. I'd majored in art in my undergraduate degree for 3 years before switching over to Middle Eastern Studies.
I wonder how many remote viewers that were trained like you had an artistic background.
Well, they actually were looking for people with a kind of an artistic background. So
wow.
The criteria for selecting intelligence officers to be in the program was that they were competent in their skill, that they were fairly high intelligence, that they had done everything they're supposed to do as an intelligence officer and competent and all that. Plus, one other thing, that they were involved in some kind of creative pursuit. And the ones that were kind of under consideration was music, studio art of some kind, maybe creative writing, such like that. Languages, although language is not as uncommon in intelligence, but more than one foreign language, it tends to use a different part of the brain. Any one of those things was an indicator. I happen to have done all 4 of them, so that was one of the reasons they thought they'd take a flyer on me. But any kind of thing that activates the right brain, where you're exercising the link between right and left and enabling the right brain, trying to bring it out of its normal slavery to the left brain, that was deemed as a good indicator that you might have some success as a remote viewer. So if somebody comes to take my course and they're very left brain, I try and beat that out of them to some degree.
That's funny.
Figuratively speaking.
How would you know if someone's left or right brain?
Electrical engineer is going to be left brain.
How about broadcasting?
Broadcasting is probably mixed.
Yeah.
And just knowing someone's background can give you a better idea. But oftentimes you don't know when they show up. But within a short time, you realize where they're coming from.
I want to get back to one part about time that you were talking about when you talked about the future is more sketchy than going back into the past.
Yes.
I want to distill that. I want you to distill that for audiences, and then I want to answer the question about the specific applications that are concrete and doable that one may be motivated to learn remote viewing in order to access.
Okay. You notice that the thread that's holding this interview together is time?
Yes.
Okay, so future. We've talked about past, we've talked about present, we're going to talk about future. It's interesting to note in remote viewing experiments and such that remote viewing past events and past things in the past, and remote viewing things in the present, or as I've described, the very recent past, you tend to be fairly accurate at that and fairly successful. So I'd say roughly 70%, 70 to 80% depending on your skill level. In certain stretches, you might even get higher than that, but that's roughly where we'll go.
That's still great.
Yeah. Considering you shouldn't be able to do it at all, it's actually quite amazing. But the future, when you start remote viewing the future, success rate drops off dramatically. It goes down 5, 10, maybe 15% if you're lucky. And I think the reason that is because the future doesn't exist yet. Now, that sounds kind of silly. Well, of course the future doesn't exist. But you have to realize there's a number of metaphysical systems which speculate that the future really does exist, and that rather than we flowing along with a wave of time that moves into the future, that we're actually just consciousness traveling along a fixed timeline, and that we have the illusion that time is moving when it's really us that is.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
Yeah. The remote viewing evidence, however, suggests that model is not right. It suggests that the idea of the future as being a bunch of potentials that aren't realized is probably the more accurate view of it.
How is it for those psychics who are accurate to the T, how are they able to access telling somebody about their future with precision data, not remote viewing, but clairvoyance? How can they transmit that when the person hasn't experienced it yet and it happens? See, that's a phenomenon that makes me wonder, well, can they both exist?
Well, a couple of things in response there. First off, you only hear the success stories. if you were actually to be able to collect all of the predictions that any psychic makes about future events.
Probably most of it's wrong.
Yes, but you don't hear the wrong stuff. First of all, that's not good publicity. Second of all, there's really not much point. It was wrong. What are you going to do with it? You know it's wrong. There's nothing you can really learn from that, right? So you hear the success stories, and the fact is that every once in a while it works. I had an experience that I gave an exact, precise, very detailed description of an event that didn't happen until 50 hours later, which astonished me to death. But the fact is, sometimes you're going to be right as a psychic or remote viewer predicting a future event, because some one of those potential futures is going to happen. You don't know which one it is. The thing that decides the time stream doesn't know what it is, because there are a number of variables that are basically oftentimes just tripped randomly. But there is one of those that's going to be realized. And if you happen to remote view the right possible future, then you're going to be right. Again, we're putting quotes around that word,
Yes.
right? You're going to be right. If you remote view the wrong probable future or possible future, you're going to be wrong. Again, quotes around the wrong. It's a little more complicated than that, because there are some events that are more sure to happen than others. That has to do with determinism and the role of human intention. But in general, it's kind of a crapshoot as far as whether you're going to be right or wrong about the future. And that's just because there are so many possible futures, and which one gets realized, which one gets actualized, has to do with an innumerable number of little determining events that could go one way or the other in between. I call those decision nodes. So, for example, the example I use, I think I might have said this in my book. I don't remember.
You did.
Where
Almost like a neural net kind of thing, decision nodes.
it is kind of like that, but that, of course, is still deterministic. This is I think the eccentricity wheel in all of this is human intentionality. That it's really, there's two things. Random events, such as the decay of nuclear particles, and human intentionality are the two things that throw off the future from being deterministic. Deterministic meaning you could predict the future if you knew all the variables, if everything was just determined. Right?
So how are all these remote viewers packaging their works? I don't want to name names, but
Yeah.
how is it that they're able, in good conscience, to package this ability to predict and see the future with using remote viewing as a tool to, and yet a very high probability of being able to access the future with remote viewing drops considerably?
Well, the key there is good conscience. There's a Mark Twain short story which I absolutely love. It's something like the remarkable story of the recent spate of crimes in Handleysburg, Mississippi, or something like that. In the story, there's this huge outbreak of crimes. It's all created by one guy who managed previously to get his conscience trapped in a corner of the room and kill it. So he no longer has a conscience, and he doesn't have any problem committing crimes. That's a little harsh. But if you can look at some of these claims out there, and you'll see that prediction after prediction after prediction has been made, and continues to fail. None of them come true. There are a couple claims of coming true predictions, but if you look at it, it's data fitting, really.
Do you think that the project Stargate would have been funded if the funders knew that you would have more access to the past, or the recent past and the entire past, and that you would have great difficulty accessing data in the future?
Well, the fact is, most of our targeting was actually they didn't really target us on the future very much. We were collecting intelligence real time. That's what they were looking for, and to some degree past. For example, they wanted to know what was going on in a Soviet weapons laboratory right now.
Okay.
They didn't so much want to know what was going to happen a week from now there, because they needed to find out what was going on now. And oftentimes we would do like a terrorist group having a meeting in some place in Yemen or someplace, and they wanted to know what might have gone on at that meeting, and we'd get targeted on those kind of things. So occasionally we get future targeting, but it was mostly kind of standard intelligence stuff. The intelligence industry or intelligence community, they bring in the intelligence, and then the analysts are the ones that do the forecasting.
And I know that remote viewing, from reading your book cover to cover, actually, and ladies and gentlemen, we're with Paul Smith, who is the author of Reading the Enemy's Mind Inside Stargate, America's Psychic Espionage Program. So, Paul, the question here is, obviously, you can go back and you can remote view in real time. You can remote view the past. And the intelligence focus is on like what can happen right now. That's with the military background focus. But the question is, for the average person who wants to develop the skill to be able to locate and transcend time and space, what applications, like, can I do anything in looking at investments? Can I do anything in terms of finding a place to live? Can I do anything in terms of bettering my life using remote viewing? Can you describe different scenarios that would be applicable to becoming a remote viewer and
Sure.
bettering our lives?
Sure. Of course, obviously, if you could obtain information from a distant location or an unknown event or whatever, that has utility. The government used it to collect intelligence for that very reason, that they were able to get, it was used as a last-ditch thing, last-ditch solution when all other intelligence methodologies failed, but they could use us to get information they couldn't otherwise get. There's a value in that, obviously, and you can extend that into the civilian world. You can go, in terms of supporting criminal cases, police operations and stuff. You use it in forensics, that sort of thing. Now, the average person isn't going to do that, obviously. So how else can you use it? Well, one goes back to the discussion we were just having on the future and time. There's actually one way to guarantee a future event and be able to determine the outcome of a future event. And when I say guarantee, that's within 70 to 80% accuracy. It's a thing called associative remote viewing, where, let's say, you have a sports team playing. My favorite choice is the UT Longhorns versus the Texas A&M, right? So you have a football game. Longhorns, A&M. Who's going to win? You want to bet on the outcome so that you make money. Well, how do you do that? Well, if you ask a remote viewer, okay, A&M is playing UT tomorrow. I want to know who's going to win. So can you give me the information? The remote viewer is going to only get as good as chance. They won't be any better than flipping a coin in that scenario.
Based on that kind of question?
Based on that kind of question. Yes or no questions posed to a remote viewer usually don't produce much more than a chance outcome because their left brain cognitive function gets involved. And it amounts to no more than a guess.
Doesn't also ego get involved on the yes-no?
It can.
It can be brought in more significantly?
I did one of these things against the Super Bowl a few years ago. Involved, I think it's the first one the Patriots won, and I don't know anything about football. The Patriots were playing somebody else. I don't remember. If you had asked me, are the Patriots going to win, or these other guys, whoever that was, I don't know anything about football. It would have been a guess, right? So in that case, ego wouldn't have been involved. It just would have been a coin flip. But somebody else who has an investment in it, like they like the Patriots, then they might bias their answer in that favor. So it's even worse than a coin flip. Okay, so but what you do is to get all of that out, ego, cognitive interpretations and interpolations, all that stuff out of the picture. You focus on remote viewing's abilities and how it's most successful. And so instead of telling the viewer that you want them to tell you who wins the game, you say, I want you to describe a target I'm going to show you day after tomorrow. And what you do, and we're assuming the viewer is somebody else, what you do is you pick two objects. One is going to stand for UT winning. The other one is going to stand for A&M winning. So let's say you say, okay, well, if UT wins, I am going to show the viewer an apple. If A&M wins, I'm going to show the viewer a pencil. Okay, so at this point, you have no idea who's going to win. The game is played, UT wins. Of course they win. My alma mater, soon to be, right? The Longhorns win. So you, on the day after the game, you go to the viewer and say, here's the object that you remote viewed. Okay, now, That's the process. But what happens is you tell the viewer the day before this game is played, say, I'm going to show you an object on the day after tomorrow. I want you to describe it for me. Well, neither of you know who's going to win the game, but at the day after tomorrow, you are going to show the viewer an object. So the viewer tries to project forward, and come up with information that helps him or her determine what, the description of the object. And so let's say the viewer sketches round, says it's red, kind of sweet smelling and soft. Well, that's not a pencil. And so you bet on UT before the game starts, because what the viewer is telling you is you're going to show him or her that apple the day after the game. So you bet on the game, you win lots of money because UT wins, and then you absolutely have to give the viewer that apple, if that's really what happens, okay, that the UT wins. And what happens here is that you are collapsing all those possible futures in that one small corner of the timeline down to a guaranteed event. Because you've made a contract with the viewer. You are going to give the viewer that feedback that corresponds to who wins that game day after tomorrow. And so there is no varied future there. It's kind of a stovepipe that goes straight to that event. And roughly 70-80% of the time, an experienced viewer will provide a description that's sufficiently clear to allow the person to make the right decision as to what the outcome of the event is going to be.
So, Paul, does that translate as that everything can be known and accessed, and that the future can be accessed in this way? Because that's kind of what you're describing in this scenario, a methodology to access this future.
In theory, I would say you could do that. In practice, you can't.
You mean you can't using remote viewing?
You can't doing anything because, first of all, the future doesn't exist. If you want to know how the future is going to come out, you can know how it's going to come out if you could come up with a different target for each possible outcome. But first of all, knowing what the outcomes are is impossible for all of the future. Only in a narrow thing where you have control over what the possible outcomes are.
Like in the example of the game, right?
Yeah.
It had very limited aspects of comparison and, right?
It has to be something that has a finite set of possible outcomes. And the actual potential futures, those are infinite, essentially infinite, the possibilities. So you couldn't do that. But you can actually extend this social remote viewing model a little bit broader. For example, we try to do the Pick 3 Texas Lottery when I do a social remote viewing class. So I'm probably going to have one in January or February. When I do a social remote viewing course, our graduation exercises try and predict the Texas Pick 3 Lottery. But that requires 10 possible distractor targets. So instead of an apple and a pencil, you've got to have an apple, an egg beater, a pencil, an inkwell, a rubber ball, a handgun, I don't know, any possible set of objects. Or you can use photos. You also use photos. But the problem is that the more of these things you get, the more they're similar. And so the more you're going to have overlaps between objects. And so your results become more and more ambiguous. Still doable. One of my students, ARV students, won the Texas Pick 3 twice in 2 weeks and had the correct numbers in the correct order except for 1 or 2 8 times using this associative remote viewing process on a 10 target set like that. That is amazing. Statistically, that is hugely amazing success. It should never happen. It is so statistically amazing. But because she used the methodology, she was actually able to make money in the Texas Pick 3 lottery. It's not a huge lottery. You don't make a huge amount of money.
What other civilian applications do people come for? Can you name it? Because not everybody's going to be looking for lost children and helping police departments.
Right. And they're maybe not, well, I should say about the ARV thing, quite a few people using it for stock investments.
Okay.
It can be useful any kind of future binary event, something that's got 2 outcomes or limited number of outcomes you can use it for. So They use it. I've seen some use it in the currency markets and in stock markets and in lottery and in sports betting and that kind of thing. So it has a variety of investment possibilities here. Now, not everybody's investing either. And I have to tell you that in this respect, remote viewing is kind of a pioneer frontier field, because in the past it's mostly been used for collecting intelligence or solving problems that have to do with forensics and such, or investing in the sense I've said.
And in that context, there's teams involved. Like even if
usually.
People are trained, in your book you even talk about there's the viewer, there's the analyst, there's the person with the target, right? Yes.
In fact, it's interesting. Remote viewing really is best when there are more people involved and they all know what their roles are. An associative remote viewing project like I just described, you really need usually two people. Now, there's one case where a guy did it all himself, but he was a computer genius and he programmed his computer to present targets and do the judging and all that stuff. It's just way complicated and it's out of the reach of most people. So normally you need to have more than one person involved in it. One of the crucial things that I should have mentioned long ago and I didn't, in a remote viewing session, the viewer should not know what the target is.
Right, you put that in your book actually, again and again and again.
It is absolutely crucial. If the viewer knows what the target is, you cannot rely on the data that's produced.
But what if the viewer, like, let's say I come in and I get trained in Austin, and I'm asking the question, I'm trained in viewing, right? But I'm asking the question about a particular stock. You mean that can't happen? I'm confused.
Well, in an associative remote viewing thing, you can, because you can know what the stock is. You just can't know what the targets are that are linked with the outcomes.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
I got you.
So, but there is now some work afoot to look into medical remote viewing. There's a bunch of folks playing around with it, to some degree having some success. It's not, there's only, oftentimes it's kind of an ad hoc hobby kind of approach where it isn't carefully controlled and isn't carefully pursued, so that we aren't making quite the progress that I really would like to see. But there are some value in that. I mean, you use remote viewing in a situation where you don't really have a medical test that can accomplish what you need to accomplish or whatever. But it's a very interesting thing that people are intrigued by, applying it in a medical field.
Can you talk about the signal line? I would really like to go back to
how
the signal line. Explain what you mean. And I want to quote something from page 166 in your book. Okay. It says, the goal of remote viewing is to set the subconscious to loosen its grip on some of this hoard of data so we can do something useful with it. It first must get across the Lyman or the Lyman?
Lemon.
The Lemon.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and how does this relate to what you were referring to as the signal line in the subconscious?
Okay, well, the signal line is kind of a term of art that Ingo Swann coined to capture the notion of the information that comes in to the viewer, because we don't know how it gets there. We don't know what carries the information. We don't know any of that stuff. So we had to have a term to refer to the information gaining process, and signal line was a good choice. The reason it isn't just signal is because the word signal implies some kind of, for many folks, you might think of electromagnetic sorts of phenomena, and it is definitely not electromagnetic. This is something else that we just don't understand. So the information comes in, and signal line is the word we use for that. But the problem is, I think most people involved in the field think that we have all kinds of ESP information entering our subconscious all the time, but it normally gets filtered out before it ever gets to conscious awareness. And so the methodology is aimed, the CRV methodology is aimed at trying to help the viewer bring that ESP content up into conscious awareness, where we can work with it, where we can report it, where we can objectify it so that other people know the information. It doesn't do us any good in the subconscious, or relatively little good. It helps in intuition oftentimes, of course. But generally, it doesn't have a broader use unless we can actually cognize it and actually bring it out and make it something that other people can be aware of. You see, it doesn't do any good to have a underlying hunch that there's a terrorist attack going to happen, What does help is if you actually can describe the circumstances and give a good description of the location. But you can't do that if it's still hanging out just in your subconscious. Now, the lemon is the threshold between the conscious awareness and the subconscious. And in a way, it's also another hand-waving term, since we don't know exactly what the subconscious is or what makes that different, right? It's just not the consciousness. But nonetheless, the idea is to get the information up across the lemon and into the conscious awareness.
So there's something that you mention a lot in your book called analytical overlay, which you said was one of the most important aspects of training you got out of SRI. Can you explain that to the listener and how it relates to the signal line and remote viewing?
Absolutely. Analytical overlay was originally identified by Ingo Swann. They observed it in the early remote viewing experiments at SRI, but it was really explicitly described and explained by Ingo Swann. And in fact, it's right in the middle of this huge CIA report that was declassified. It's quite interesting to see how that fit in. The idea of analytical overlay is that your left brain, and I've sort of tangentially referred to this, the left brain, all of our left brains, is the residence of what a prominent psychologist named Michael Gazzaniga called the left brain interpreter. That means is our left brain, its job is to assign meanings, to interpret, to explain, to understand information that comes in from our senses. And in normal situations, it's pretty good at that. You know, you're walking down the street, certain things happen, you observe them happen. The conclusion you come to based on your left brain processing of the sensory information is usually pretty accurate. But when you get into a low bandwidth situation where the information flow is really kind of limited, such as in an ESP sort of an experience, the left brain doesn't have enough information to work on, and so it starts jumping to conclusions. It will interpret things, perceptions that you have, wrongly, and then that's what you think is what you're experiencing, is this conclusion that your left brain has jumped to. So a very quick example, if you're walking out in the woods during the daylight hours and you see a stump that has a kind of a bear outline of a bear, you look at it and say, oh, that looks like a bear. Isn't that funny? And you go on. You don't have any issues. But let's say you were out walking at dusk and everything's indistinct and you see that stump, but it looks like a bear now, even more so because it's in the dark. You may not realize it's a stump. You may actually think it's a bear. Your left brain says, oh, no, it's a bear. Let's get out of here, right? When in reality, it's still just the same stump, but you have less information about it, and therefore your left brain doesn't have enough to work on. It's kind of like, I'm certainly sure you had a friend come up to a conversation. The conversation's been going for 20 minutes, and they hear one sentence. And based on that one sentence, they think they know what you're talking about, and then they say something absolutely stupid, right?
I see this all the time.
Yeah. So that's what your left brain often does in a remote viewing environment, because it doesn't have enough information, but it still feels like its job is to tell you what that means.
So how do you put the left brain in its place?
Well, that's what the process is. Let me say something else, then I'll get to that. One of the reasons why psychic experiences have been so hard to capture in a lab is because for so long, people didn't understand, either psychics or researchers, didn't understand this idea of analytical overlay. They couldn't figure out why sometimes the information was really accurate and why other times it was just completely baloney. They couldn't figure that out. We now have a much better understanding of that because we now understand analytical overlay. It's still a challenge because it's still hard sometimes to tell whether something is analytical overlay or whether it's real signal line.
Is that why you have people both sketching and describing what they're seeing at the same time?
That's one of the solutions. Okay, the first thing is, the rule is you describe, you don't name. So what that means is, a name is a noun. If you're going along and you get the impression of some crisscrossing steel girders, and you want to say, oh, it's a bridge, that's your left brain getting it. It might actually be the Eiffel Tower, because the bridge and the Eiffel Tower may look similar. You don't say it's a bridge. You say it reminds me of a bridge. You kind of identify it as analysis, and you exclude it. You don't exclude it, but you put it over on the side as kind of in a holding pen. okay, I had this conclusion. It's a bridge. I think that's analysis. I'm going to put it over here. Okay, and I'm going to exclude it from the data for now, and when we find out ultimately what the target is, we'll know whether that's right or not. So you learn to identify AOL. You learn to identify it. You learn to sort it out. But there's always the questionable cases where it's hard to tell whether it's AOL or not, and then you just sort of, that's the art part of remote viewing. It's not a science, it's an art. Well, it's sort of a science, it's sort of an art. There are scientific parts and there are parts where it's just skill. In practice over time, you sort of learn what you can trust and what you can't.
Is it true that I read in your book that the more you practice, it's almost like exercise, the better you get at it? If you practice it properly?
Yes, that's right. In general terms, that's correct. Practice always helps, right? But if you are practicing a mistaken approach, then you may just be making it worse for yourself. So the idea is always pay attention and always go for what seems to be working. You always need to have feedback when you're done. You need to take your session, be able to compare it against ground truth so that you can see where you went wrong, where you went right. And if you get that, then you have some trial and error that enters in and can help you get more of a concrete, and obviously a better grasp on the process and have more success. In theory, you should actually get more consistent in producing good results.
What is a tachyon? Because I know that was mentioned early in the book, Reading the Enemy's Mind.
Tachyon is a theoretical particle. We're talking the level of quarks and photons down at the quantum level. It's a theoretical particle that has some capacity to go backwards in time. So far, they have not ever identified the actual tachyons, and they're not absolutely sure they really exist. But postulating tachyons actually helps some of these theories work. Now, you have to be careful with some of the quantum physics theories because they invent things in order to make the theory actually work. And usually they have good reasons for inventing them, but until you actually find whether that thing is there or not, you can't necessarily say the theory is true. So tachyons are one of those things that were postulated in a certain theory that if you postulated the existence of these particles that kind of go backwards in time, then that would make the theory work, and then the theory explains a whole bunch of other stuff that really does make sense. So we think that maybe the tachyons are real as well. But no one's ever been able to actually show that they exist. So,
got you. Can we go back to the signal line again and clarify that?
Yes. In fact, it sticks in my mind that there was something else I was going to say, but I don't remember what that was. Well, I'm sure it'll come back to me if it's important, right? So the signal line itself, we don't know what it is. I talked about the matrix earlier.
Yes.
And it may well be that the matrix, as it's conceived, is just a model, that the matrix is actually a bit different. And it may be different in this way. It may actually be the universe itself at the quantum level. What do I mean by that? Well, there was a physicist, David Bohm, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and he proposed that the universe could be taken in two different ways. One was what he called the explicit order, which is the order of the world we're in. Chairs, computers, people, those are all members of the explicit order, the bigger picture of the universe. But then there's the implicit order. The opposite of that, he said, was the implicit order. And the implicit order is actually the same world we were just talking about, but taken at the subatomic, the quantum level. So in that order, all there is a mass of particles, of quarks and photons and gluons and whatever all the other particles are that are here and there and the ones they're looking for. And at that level, the universe, of course, looks differently. If we could get down to that level and look, we would just see a whole bunch of particles around, and we wouldn't have the same landmarks of chairs and tables and all that kind of thing. But, okay, so far that's just a different way of looking at it. What difference does that make? Well, here's where it becomes relevant. There's a thing called quantum non-locality, or quantum entanglement, which is a very interesting feature of physics where if you take two particles, two photons, let's say, and they are very closely associated in some environment, you entangled them, they become sister photons, you split them up and you have one on one side of the universe and the other on the other side of the universe. There is still some kind of connection between the two. So if you change an attribute on one photon, that same attribute on the other photon will also change in the opposite direction. and it's instant, and it doesn't have any causal interaction that causes it. So it violates the speed of light because there is no speed involved. You can go from one side of the universe to the other in effecting this change without any time elapsing whatsoever. This is all proved out mathematically and experimentally, by the way.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
So you have this entanglement, this non-locality. And so the question is, how do you get things entangled? Well, you have them very closely associated in the past. Well, wait a minute. The whole universe at one point, if the Big Bang Theory is correct, and it's pretty much universally accepted, there's some disagreeers, but if the Big Bang Theory is correct, then the entire universe at one point before the Big Bang was crammed into a thing called a singularity. A singularity violates the laws of physics because it is a location, it is a thing that has no dimension and yet contains everything.
Is that related to Ray Kurzweil's work?
Could be. Okay. I'm not real familiar.
I never heard the definition of the singularity the way you just gave it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's basically what it is. That's why they call it singularity, because it's quite singular. I don't know. but at any rate, a Big Bang, of course, that singularity essentially exploded, although there's probably a more technical way of describing that, and expanded into the universe. Space is created as the matter in it expands into what now has become the universe. But the interesting thing is that you don't get more closely associated than being in a space with no dimension, and yet everything is there. So everything at some point was very closely associated with the suggestion that maybe everything is entangled with everything else. And so you have these possible influences between all particles in the universe. And so it may well be that what happens in a remote viewing session is that the viewer, through his or her subconscious, goes into brain function, and the fundamental layers of brain functioning are quantum processes. So get involved in the brain functioning at the quantum level and are able then to access any point in the universe through this non-local function, and therefore obtain information from any corner of the universe, mostly here on the planet, but anywhere else in theory, right? And so that information just comes in through the non-local process. So it isn't really a signal. It isn't really a line. There is nothing going back and forth, and yet the information just comes based on this.
It's a capacity, though.
I'm sorry?
It's a capacity.
It's a capacity, I guess. We really don't have a good word to describe it, and that's probably as good as any in this case.
So are we all one? So with that said, which is remarkable, could it be said that then you and me and the universe and all of us are connected as one organism, an intelligent organism on some level?
Well, you say we're connected. Whether how far that unity goes, I don't know. But this is interesting because Doug Adams, the guy that wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he also wrote a book called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, and the whole book is premised on this idea of the interconnectedness of all things.
It sounds like from the remote viewing work that you've done in the model and the teaching that it's something that we end up accessing and finding out at some point, that connectedness is beyond our conscious mind.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, yeah.
Talk about the mental noise that goes on in the remote viewing learning and what people have to deal with when they're being trained regarding mental noise. Some of it you talked about related to analytical overlay.
Yeah, it is. And the largest component of mental noise is analytical overlay, but there are other species as well. One is environmental overlay, where features in your environment can creep in unawares and end up in your session. I mean, they discovered this back with in some of their early sessions. Of course, this is the early 70s, and you had orange shag carpet on the floor and turquoise walls, and there were picture sailboats, who knows what, right? So the viewer might be going along and describe something that's orange and fuzzy and turquoise and pictures and talk about sailing or something like that. And the target might be, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower, right? There's nothing orange and fuzzy there. It's not turquoise and there's no sailboats. So where'd that come from? And then they'd look around the room and say, oh, it leaked in from the environment. So we learned to deal with that. There are also inclemencies, which are the problems you may be having, emotional, situational problems, things you got to worry about, errands you have to run, that your mind is trying to keep in mind so you don't forget things that are bugging you, and you have to get that out in order to do a clean remote viewing session. So you learn how to compartmentalize that temporarily before you go on with your session, and that helps to keep it clean as well. So
I thought it was interesting in the book when you shared, and I may not be saying this properly, but how right before you do remote viewing, you're supposed to name all the things that like are on your mind, your biases, or what the things that are going on that are occupying you, issues you have, so that you kind of clear it. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, and those are inclemencies. Like, oh no, I'm going through a divorce. I still have to do this remote viewing session. Okay, over on the side you write, going through a divorce. You acknowledge that's a problem, and basically you're making a deal with your subconscious. Let me let go of this problem for now, and I promise I'll start worrying about it again once the session is over. Right? Going through divorce, I have a cold, I have a broken leg, my cat got run over, the IRS is auditing me. My mother-in-law is coming to visit. I don't know, whatever might be issues. You just need to set those aside temporarily while you're doing the session. But in order to do that, you have to promise your subconscious that you will take them seriously once you're done. And then surprisingly, actually allows you to do that. It works very well. In fact, it's very useful in other parts of life too. If you need, have something you really need to concentrate on, but you're being eaten, if something's eating at you, it's really bugging you, identify what that thing is that's eating you, set it aside with the agreement that you'll start worrying about it again once you're done with the thing you have to concentrate on, and then you can concentrate, and then you go back to whatever it is that's you have to worry about. So it works quite amazingly well once you learn how to do it.
Because the questions that we ask are going to pull for the range or the depth in which they're asked. Could it also be said that the whole area of asking questions is also an aspect of having successful and effective remote viewing outcomes, or no?
Well, okay, so I'm going to equate asking questions with the tasking that a remote viewer might get. Okay, so the question might be, where is Osama bin Laden? Okay, that may be what you want to find out. Now, the viewer is not going to get that. The viewer is just going to get a number which stands for that. The viewer cannot know that it's Osama bin Laden that you want to know about.
Okay.
But the person who writes the tasking has to be very explicit and very careful to specify exactly what they're looking for. You would actually not ask, where is Osama bin Laden? You would say, describe the present location of Osama bin Laden, especially important landmarks, or something like that, right? You want to be very specific in time and space to whatever degree you can. Now, on something you don't know where it is, you obviously can't specify the space. But you can say, describe the present location of Osama bin Laden. That is a good specific way of saying it, and then the viewer will hopefully describe it. If you want the remote viewer to, in a practice session, say the target is the Eiffel Tower, then you're going to want to say something like, describe the Eiffel Tower present time. Now, when you get into more things, obviously the tasking gets more complicated, and you have to be, again, very careful about how you state it, because interestingly enough, the subconscious is quite literal in its interpretation of things. And if you give it an ambiguous tasking, it will default to the one that makes the most sense to it, even if that may not be what you had in mind. I really need to come up with a good example of this, but if you phrase a tasking that could have two different meanings, you use a word that might be a bit ambiguous, then you might end up getting an exact, literal, actual, really good remote viewing session that gives you the wrong information about the wrong target because you weren't specific in your tasking.
And this is what has also been said to be true about goals and accomplishment.
Yes.
That the specificity in which and the clarity in which the goal or the accomplishment is articulated provides variation and distillation, almost like its own field in which it can show up, so to speak.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other show.
I think a lot of times people build ambiguity into their goals because they either consciously or subconsciously want to give themselves an out.
That's very perceptive. That's very, very, very perceptive. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have been dialoguing with Paul Smith, the author of Reading the Enemy's Mind, and the president of the International Remote Viewing Association. He can be reached at www.rviewer.com. We'd like to invite you back, Paul, with a couple of other guests as well to go deeper into the subject. We thank you for your time today, and we hope that the audience has a very clear frame of reference on the remote viewing program that's available in the world today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been great.